I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we'll discuss the latest updates from Ukraine, with a focus on the catastrophic Russian crossing of the Seversky Donets River. And I interview Ukraine's answer to Graham Norton, Timur Miroshnychenko, who'll be commentating on the Eurovision Song Contest from a bomb shelter in Kyiv.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 13th of May, day 79. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Nicholls, Assistant Foreign Editor, Venetia Rainey, and Assistant Comment Editor, Dearnley. I started by asking Dom and Venetia for the latest updates from the Battlefront.
Hi David. Hi everybody. So a couple of things first off. Snake Island. We've been saying keep an eye on Snake Island for a few days now. This is the very small island in the northwest of the Black Sea, critical use for Russia if they want to do an amphibious landing in the area of Odessa. They simply have to hold Snake Island. They can't do it if it's in Ukrainian hands, and they're able to put any air defence and anti-ship missiles and other forces on that island. So Russia has to hold Snake Island. They took it earlier in the war. It's been contested ever since. We're not entirely sure what is left on it. Russia did hold it, and there was a number of airstrikes, both by sort of traditional fast air and drones that have destroyed a number of facilities on the island, and also sunk a landing craft. So in the last 24 hours, we've seen a massive Russian floating self-propelled crane turn up, possibly to recover the Cerner-class landing ship that is wrecked and kind of blocking the area that they need access to if they're going to unload landing craft there. It may also have unloaded a landing craft itself, just literally lifted it off the deck and put it in the water. But they need to clear out the wreck that's under the water there. You can see on the satellite imagery. The wreck that was there was hit by a TB2 Bayraktar drone, we think on May the 7th or thereabouts. So it's an indication of how important Russia sees Snake Island. I mean, there's a massive target there right now. This crane. There's been no action against it in the last few hours. Whether Ukraine are going to attempt to do something against it, we will obviously see over the next day. But no, Snake Island is still being very heavily contested. The second area we should look at is this failed river crossing in the Donbass over the Seversky Donets River. This has resulted in dozens of armoured vehicles, tanks, BMP, BTR, trucks as well, and assessed hundreds of deaths, casualties from Russian troops trying to get across this river. There's a number of things about this. So in today's British MOD Defence Intelligence estimate, they're saying that this failed river crossing it shows how Russian commanders are under pressure to get things going. I don't actually agree with that. I don't think in and of itself it shows that they're under pressure to get things going. This was a river crossing. This was a tactical action that would have an operational imperative, because what they're trying to do is seemingly they're trying to encircle Severodonetsk in that area. Just to pause for a moment there. Interesting now that seems to be the main effort that Russia are having such a problem achieving. It was only a few weeks ago that there was talk of, oh my God, they're going to encircle the Donbass. They're going to push up from Mariupol. They'll come down from Kharkiv. They're going to encircle the whole of the Donbass and cut off the resupply routes from the west. I mean, that has simply not happened. And there's been huge... Russia's very slowly taking ground in the Donbass, but at a huge cost. And this relatively small tactical action has led to disaster. I disagree with the MOD assessment in a way, because any obstacle crossing, river crossings or minefield crossings, or any obstacle crossing is always a very, very tricky passage of military activity, fraught with risk. The enemy know that the obstacle is there. If it's a minefield, obviously they know it's there because they've laid it. River crossings there's only a certain number of places that it would be appropriate or impossible to do a river crossing with armoured vehicles. So a decent ground recce from, in this case, Ukraine, would have identified a number of potential spots where this could take place. They should have been covering that. They may well have been covering all of them with eyes in the sky, and maybe other sensors on the ground to indicate movement, and possible thermal images, for example, show if anyone is showing an interest there. And then from the Russian side, you can't just rock up and put together a pontoon bridge. If the river is too deep for tanks to wade across, then and armoured vehicles, then they need these pontoon bridges, basically just floating on top, tethered either side. This takes hours to do. So you've got this very vulnerable area that's going to take hours of hard engineering effort to get across, and you've got to necessarily bunch a load of stuff together in a very small piece of geography. So any kind of obstacle crossing is a really, really tricky manoeuvre for a military force to do. In the case of a river crossing, you've got to dominate your home bank, you've got to dominate the far bank, you've got to have a decent headquarters sited close enough to be able to see what's going on, but not so close that it's going to get whacked by artillery if that starts coming in. You need to have your crossing force, so the first force that's going to be across, held at some distance so that they're not in the immediate contact battle if it all starts going wrong, and then they have to charge across the makeshift bridge or however you've done it, and dominate the far bank so that they can then push any counterattack from, in this case, Ukraine, away and secure that site. But for a small period of time, all these forces come together, and it looks as though Russia have either bunched too many forces together and just not been able to get over the river in any great numbers. There are Russian casualties in terms of vehicles and undoubtedly personnel as well on the west bank, so the Ukrainian bank of the river. So they did manage to get across, but that force was then they didn't get across in sufficient numbers to either repel any counterattack or have enough electronic warfare assets or air defence assets to knock out the drones that were clearly watching them and seeing what was going on and able to call in artillery. So the whole thing was just a bit of a complete disaster for Russia. Now, there's a chance that that Russian forces were widely dispersed and that these casualties we see were just the ones who happened to be there at the time. I doubt that, because the numbers are just staggering. I mean, this looks like it's been assessed it's an entire battalion tactical group that's been destroyed. And so it's unlikely that this was just one small part of a much wider force trying to get over the river. So it does look like that they were too bunched together. Whatever happened with the pontoon bridge, that hasn't worked because it's now in pieces in the water, even though, as I say, some Russian forces did make it to the west bank. So they just Ukraine had some very good knowledge, some very good reconnaissance of the area to work out where they might want to be keeping a close eye on, and then were able to call in fire very accurately and very quickly. Now, just a final point on this, there was a social media feed from Maxim. We haven't seen Maxim before, but he was claiming that he sort of played a pivotal role in all this, which is fine. Good luck to Maxim. It sounds from his description that he's a kind of engineer recce element, and that's fine. I don't think he gave away anything particularly of operational security. It's a bit unusual to have somebody so quickly after the event or in the middle of a war come up and say it was all me, thanks, even if there's been some suggestions that the people who are taking to social media are looking to their sort of post-war career potentially. But I just wonder if this is a little bit of disinformation or a little bit of subterfuge by Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine are playing the information campaign brilliantly, as we've seen through this war. And I just wonder if Maxim, whoever he, she, or it, the bot-created Maxim might be, if that is there to divert attention away from too much attention, too many questions about exactly how did Ukraine manage to get this targeting so precise and bring down such a heavy weight of fire so accurately to destroy this battalion tactical group. And I'll just leave that thought there.
Thanks, Tom. Incredibly comprehensive. Venetia and Francis, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so there's a few more details. I think Dom is right that we should always be suspicious of these sort of very granular accounts that we get so soon after the fact. But there are some more details in Maxim's account that seem to be sort of corroborated with some of the pictures, some of the satellite pictures that we can see. He talks about how the area had very low visibility. The Russians have been throwing around smoke grenades. The forests nearby had been set on fire, and in addition, it was also really foggy. So they'd been doing recce's in advance through, they'd been sort of sending boats up and down the river. They knew the Russians wanted to cross the river. It's the longest in eastern Ukraine. They'd been doing recce's up and down in boats, trying to figure out where the most likely place was that they'd cross. And as Dom said, they'd identified a few spots that they were keeping an eye on. And the Ukrainian forces knew when it was foggy, they knew something was going on. They were waiting to hear the sound of motorboats, is how he says it. And the motorboats would suggest that they were then tugging across the sections of the pontoon bridge, and that would mean that vehicles were getting ready to cross. And they waited until the vehicles were crossing, had sort of already started the cross, before they called in the artillery. And that's what led to such massive devastation. As Dom said, some were left stranded on the other side and were quite quickly obliterated. The bridges themselves were destroyed, obviously, the people who were still waiting on the other side. So yeah, dozens of military vehicles, hundreds of Russian soldiers killed. And it does seem a pretty extraordinary example of a Ukrainian victory in terms of, reconnaissance and intelligence. It's unclear how much help they might have got from abroad, for example, from the US. We know the US's intelligence sharing might have contributed satellite imagery, might have had other information that they could help the Ukrainians out with. There's some suggestion that maybe there was a drone involved as well. So yeah, really just an incredible story, and we've got a long read up on it on the Telegraph's website, so I would encourage all of our listeners to get stuck into that.
Thanks, Venetia. Thanks, Dom. Can we talk a little bit about a Russian man called Vadim Shimisarin? He's the commander of the Kantomirovskaya tank division. The Ukrainians are putting him on trial. I believe he's the first Russian soldier to go on trial in Ukraine for actions in this war. What's happening there? Can we talk about this?
Yeah, so this man is accused essentially of shooting an unarmed civilian who was riding his bicycle home. This was back in February 28th, just a couple of days after the invasion began on February 24th. And it was in a small town between sort of Sumy and Kharkiv out in the northeast of the country. And this guy was a 62-year-old man was riding his bicycle home when a group of Russian soldiers in apparently a stolen car drove past. And this soldier put his gun out the window and fired a shot at this man. He said in a confession video given to the Ukrainian forces who captured him later, he said he fired a single shot. The guy was shot in the head and he died shortly afterwards, sort of a couple of dozen meters away from his home. And he's now being put on trial for this war crime under the Ukrainian criminal code. He faces life in prison. But really the significance of this is that we're already starting to see Ukrainians trying to bring Russian soldiers to justice. They've obviously captured a bunch of Russian soldiers. They'll also be trying some people in absentia. There's a case coming up next week, a really awful case where they're trying a Russian soldier in absentia for murdering a man and raping a woman in front of her child in their family home. Really awful stuff, but they have collected the evidence, they've collected witness testimonies, and they want to start prosecuting these things now. You can argue that maybe it's better to wait until the conflict's over, but no one really knows when that will be. So I think this is a good step towards trying to find some kind of justice for these crimes. Of course, the question is, under what conditions were some of these confessions obtained? Will the people who are standing trial, these Russian soldiers, they're entitled to fair legal representation? Will they be getting that? So some questions around that, but yeah, that's what's happening today.
If I could just add something to what Venetia was saying there, and I'm sure we'll make references in a minute around the fact that we've actually got footage of these atrocities that have been committed. One of the most interesting, I think, facets of this conflict has been the way in which, of course, through social media, but other big data sources, particularly those compiled by Bellingcat, which we've made references to before, have allowed us to be able to make real-time records of the crimes that we are seeing in the war in Ukraine, mostly committed by the Russians, but there have also been instances of Ukrainians committing this on Russians as well. I think it's important to say that. And of course, this will be of huge significance in trials moving forward, whether that be of Russian generals or just of individual soldiers, as in the account here. I think it's just worth emphasising this, because in conflicts in the past, this has actually been something that has been enormously challenging and has actually very often not occurred. If you're looking at the Second World War, then it was the perspective of the Allied powers that really all they could do was try the sort of Nazi party officials and the ministers and a few generals, but really they didn't try and put that many individual soldiers on trial until later, who'd committed, of course, the most heinous examples of the Holocaust. But now I don't think that will be the case. I think the world has moved on, and there's a sense that because we have access to this information, that this will be something that won't be temporary. This will be something that for decades to come we will be reading about trials of people who committed crimes in the last few months. So I just think it's a positive change of in the past these awful crimes would have gone either unreported or would have just the people who perpetrated them would have been able to get away with them. Now, with technology being as it is, I think the chances of that are greatly reduced, and we should celebrate that. It's one of the few examples of perhaps a positive outcome from this war.
Just to add to that, I think one of the sort of key questions after World War II was this question of responsibility. You know, to what extent can you prosecute the camp guard? Although we have been prosecuting some camp guards, some very old camp guards. I believe someone who's 101 is set to go on trial in Germany next week. But to what extent are these people actually responsible for their crimes, and to what extent were they just following orders? This Russian soldier who's on trial today said that he was just following orders from a commander who was in the car. Does that absolve him of responsibility? You know, will those arguments still wash? I think it's really interesting to see how that plays out.
If I could just also say on that, I think it's been a fascinating shift in recent decades on that very point. As I say, when the war ended, there was really this idea that to follow orders was actually an accepted defence. But that very gradually shifted over the decades, particularly due to campaigning from the Simon Wiesenthal Centre and others, that basically said that no, actually, if you committed a crime, then you are responsible for that, regardless of what the orders were. And of course, the Eichmann trial in the 1960s helped shift the narrative on that as well. He cited the defence of himself just following orders. Most famously, there was the book on the trial of Eichmann by Hannah Arden, who was there reporting for the New Yorker on his trial. And she regarded him as an example of the banality of evil, of sort of bureaucrats, pen pushers who do awful things but absolve themselves from responsibility because they see themselves as just following orders, as I say. That book was very influential, but has actually been, in the years since it was published, quite heavily disputed, not only in the sort of moral terms, as Venetia was saying. We now think that the people are responsible regardless of the orders that they have received, but also just purely in the example of Eichmann's case as being inaccurate. He was not just this sort of pen-pushing bureaucrat. He was somebody who actually was a vicious anti-Semite, and he even learnt Hebrew in order to facilitate him being able to carry out his orders more effectively. So I just mentioned that as an example of how things have shifted since the Second World War into how we see the culpability of those who've committed acts. And as I say, now that is coupled with actually us able to find these people far easier with the technology that has been afforded to us. So a very interesting shift, but I think a positive one.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you, Venetia. Can we talk a little bit about the news today on the EU and the proposed sanctions on Russian oil and gas? There's been quite a bit of movement today and some disagreement about it. So can we talk about that? Venetia and Francis, what's happening here?
Yes, well, as you say, the European Union has been debating this now for some time, as we've talked about in much detail. There still remains to be a conclusion that is reached that all sides can agree to. Essentially, you've got tension between the two, between sort of the Western powers that want to go further. Some of them, of course, are newly converts to that cause of going further, but nonetheless, they're steering things forward in a direction where they want to be banning the entirety of Russian oil by the end of the year, less so on gas, which we've talked about in the past. But some other nations within the European Union are now much more sceptical of that, and are worried, of course, because they're more reliant on Russian oil, but also on in terms of weaponry and support. I'm thinking particularly of Hungary, that are much more reluctant to go down that road. And so some tensions have opened up within the European Union as with regard to what the direction of travel is. Of course, it's important to say that countries can operate independently of the European Union policy, as we've seen obviously in the examples of the Czech Republic and Poland. And yet, I think it's a vital point to make out that they are actually often operating outside of the, I suppose, desire of the European Union, who may want to do things more slowly in terms of the military support that were offered. Of course, initially that was the case with France and Germany, who I think desired to have a uniform response to the crisis, but actually Czech Republic and Poland have effectively went against that, and were willing to sort of go further than desire, and it may well have proved absolutely crucial in saving lives, particularly obviously Poland taking in over 3 million refugees. If they had not been willing to do so, if they had waited for a coordinated response organised from the European Union, then I don't think necessarily that would have been as quickly forthcoming, and who knows what there would have been the consequences of that would have been.
Venetia and Dom, anything more to add on this?
But I think one of the part of the proposed package of sanctions, which the EU is desperate to get through, it's like their 6th or maybe 7th tranche that they're trying to get through, which has been stumbling over this issue of oil, are sanctions against more of Putin's inner circle, including Putin's wife, Lyudmila Orekhnaya, and Putin's girlfriend, Alina Kabeva. The UK has actually just announced sanctions against both of those women and a couple of his cousins as well. So I think we're sort of starting to see the noose tighten around more of Putin's people that were previously seen as untouchable from Putin's innermost personal circle. We're now starting to see sanctions go after them as well.
Thanks, Venetia. Can we talk about forced deportations? I mean, we've seen an update in the Telegraph's live blog today that Ukraine has accused Russia of forcibly deporting more than 200,000 children to turn them into Russian citizens. I know we've heard from Theo Meurs, the Deputy Foreign Editor, that this is something that the Foreign Desk are looking into. And Venetia and Francis and Dom, can we say much more about what we know about these deportations, specifically of children?
We don't know much, to be honest. We know Russia gave us a figure, I think a couple of weeks ago, that 1 million people had been evacuated, in scare quotes, to Russia for sort of humanitarian reasons. We can take that to mean that 1 million people have been put on trains or buses to Russia and probably given very little choice. Back when our Russia correspondent was still allowed to report in Russia, she went to some of the sort of very earliest camps on the edges of Ukraine, on the edges of the Ukrainian border inside Russia, and people there were really confused. They weren't, being told much what was happening. They were being sort of stuck on transport to far-flung parts of Russia. Some of them were given sort of things to sign that they weren't given much option to sort of decipher or decode. There's a lot of confusion. We've also heard from within Russia that there are Russian activists who've been trying to help Ukrainians to get back out of the country. They're not usually sort of locked up once they're there, but if you're stuck in the far part of Russia, then you don't always have the resources to get back to Europe or to Ukraine or to this side of the world. We don't really know what's happening with the children, but of course it's mainly women and children that are being evacuated. Some men, they're being often sent to filtration camps, the Russians call them, where they're being checked for tattoos and any other signs of the fact that they might have been Ukrainian fighters, and then we don't know what. So it's quite a sort of murky area, but yes, one that we're looking at very closely.
Thanks, Venetia. Dominic Nicholls, you've mentioned that there is some speculation about the Russian general Gerasimov. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so this is the head of Russia's entire armed forces, General Valery Gerasimov. Should make clear this is not General Vitaly Gerasimov, who was killed in the first month of the war. So General Valery Gerasimov, the head of the whole shooting match, literally, not been seen for a few days, was not seen at the Victory Day parade on Monday. And there was speculation this is important. Who is where, who gets to talk to, sit near Putin, and so on and so forth, and who is on parade and not. It is a fascinating subject, Kremlinology, of which I'm very much in the shallow end. But it was notable that he was not on parade, and also very notable that after Putin left the main dais, after the main parade of vehicles and personnel, and then moved around the corner of the Kremlin to the tomb of the unknown soldier. I mean, he and Shoigu were, I mean, at times literally shoulder to shoulder. They're walking along and rubbing shoulders. I mean, this was a very clear display of support for Shoigu. There had been speculation that Shoigu, as the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, had fallen out of favour, or perhaps a window in the Kremlin, but that is seemingly not the case. But Gerasimov, a different kettle of fish entirely. And of course, remember, it was a couple of weeks ago, Gerasimov was sent down to Ukraine to go and crack the whip and get things moving again. Very strange at the time. We suggested that actually this was just a couple of weeks after General Dvornikov was put in overall command of the effort to try and pull all the different aspects together. Up to that point, Russia had seemingly been fighting 4 wars, one in the north, one in the south, one in the east, and then the Air Force War. And Dvornikov was put in there to pull the whole thing together, make the orchestra sing. And then sending Gerasimov down so soon after that announcement was very odd. And at the time, there was speculation that this was setting up Gerasimov as the fall guy for this failed adventure, this ridiculous adventure of Putin's. I was with Ben Wallace in Finland, and I asked him if Gerasimov was going to be one of the fall guys or going to be the fall guy. And he said there's going to be fall guys all over the place. I mean, the Putin and the Russian system is not shy in finding people. And there's speculation today all over social media from Russian sources about trying to find who's responsible for the river crossing debacle, for example. So there's always heads have to roll. And there was a suggestion that Gerasimov had been sent down to Ukraine to very publicly put himself in the position of fall guy. So the fact that he's now not been seen at the Victory Day parade, not been seen for a few days, and there are suggestions, unconfirmed, important to note that, unconfirmed suggestions that he has been suspended pending all sorts of investigations. I mean, this could be the start of some warped kind of golden bridge or off-ramp for Putin. If I'll take that, happy with that. But yes, the speculation now, which should firm up over the next hours as reports come out of Russia about what's happened to General Gerasimov.
Just while we're on the subject of discussing Russian kleptocracy and generals, there's a very interesting point made on Twitter by Maxim Trudolyubov, who's the editor of the Russian File. And effectively, he makes a very good point, which is that this is now becoming a war between generations, both within Russia, but also in the context of war in Ukraine, with the Russian generals and political leaders fighting the generals, soldiers, and political leaders of Ukraine. So effectively, he points out on Twitter that in a sense, the Russian leadership represent the last generation of the Soviet-born leaders, whereas the Ukrainian leadership grew up in the 80s and 90s and are the first post-Soviet generation. And of course, there's a huge mentality shift that comes along with that. But he highlights that effectively the average age of the key officials in Russia is around 64. In Ukraine, the average age is 44. And obviously, where this plays out as being influential is the Soviet mentality is one that is quite different to in how to fight, in what things are permitted for one to do and not permitted, and I think we've seen that articulated on the ground. But also this age cohort in Russia, particularly, the reason that that this younger generation has left is or is not present anymore is either they have left, is that they have been forced out, that they've been encouraged to leave the country because they're not as loyal to Putin or to the Russian state, and we've talked about that many times, or they have actively been repressed, have been put in jail or worse, but this is actually now playing out and having real term consequences, because of course if you are fighting a modern day war, one where there is an information war on social media and everything else, then to have a younger generation who are more masterly at that, who are more adaptive at that, then that has a big role to play. And I think, as we've talked about many, many times, Zelensky's brilliance on camera, fluidity in social media, and this is something that his whole operation has been very, very good at. Many of those closest surrounding him and his advisors used to work in television. This has a big influence, and I just think it's a very interesting point that this generational battle is one that has big implications, and I think will be a much discussed area of the conflict in the years to come.
I'm sorry to come back and be so clunky, but to jump back in. But I should have said in my report there about General Gerasimov, it was Alexei Arestovich, who's President Zelensky's advisor. This is what started these suggestions. He was interviewed on YouTube, and so you'll be able to find that. And he was starting this news that Gerasimov might have been removed. He was also saying that Lieutenant General Sergei Kish, the commander of the First Tank Army, who is in charge of the Kharkiv area of operations, has also been removed. After that, the pushback, the number of counterattacks that Ukraine has managed to knit together in the north and east of Kharkiv. So it looks like the commander there may also have been removed from post. But no, Alexei Arestovich was the source for that information.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Francis. Francis Dearnley, you've been looking at a censored memo by a prominent former Chinese diplomat, which has thrown some light on China's view of Russia's failure so far. Can you tell us about this? What does it show us about how the Chinese are thinking?
Yes, well, there's been a very revealing translation of an article that was published on the website Phoenix News, which is one of the state-run media operations in China. It's by a man called Gao Yusheng, who's the former Chinese ambassador to Ukraine. And he effectively, in this article, which, as I say, was removed within hours of being uploaded, but no doubt articulates many of the thinking amongst the Communist Party elite in China, or at least the diplomatic elite. He argues that Russia is losing the war in Ukraine, again, and more of an admission than has certainly been given by the Chinese state, and reflects on the impact this may have on the international order. So whilst he's retired now, he's obviously been speaking to various academics as well. I believe it was actually based on a talk that he gave at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which is an important think tank for the party and for the government. So it was an internal event as well, I should say. So it seems likely that they would have known what his views were before he gave these remarks. But essentially what he argues is that, and I'm quoting here, that the Russian army's poverty-driven defeat was always evident. He cites the economic and financial strength of Russia compared to many of the Western powers. He says that he challenges its status as a so-called military superpower, that it wasn't able to support a high-tech war. Quote, Russia is not only in a passive position on the battlefield, but has lost in other areas. This means that it is only a matter of time before Russia is finally defeated. Again, quite a remarkable remark from somebody who is, effectively has formerly been part of a state that up until now has been rather quiet in condemning Putin, and not only that, has actually been said that they are effectively joint in the hip on foreign policy prior to the conflict. He also says Russia's political, economic, military and diplomatic power will be significantly weakened and isolated. Russia's power will weaken even more. So Ukraine would be removed from Russia's orbit and sphere of influence and become a member of the great European family, a member of the European Union. So some very interesting reflections. And I say, if this is emblematic of how the Chinese elite are currently thinking, then this is a huge shift from where they were prior to the conflict, and one that will make very, very worrying reading for Vladimir Putin, because if he loses the support of China in a world where he is increasingly diplomatically isolated from Europe and others, then he will have very few options for selling energy, very few options in terms of military support, and it only increases the likelihood of his nation becoming a pariah state. And of course, with time, that will no doubt challenge his leadership, which will give the economic impact of that. So a very, very significant intervention, I think.
Thank you very much, Francis. Before we finish for this week, I think we should talk a little bit about Eurovision, ending the week on a slightly lighter note. The Eurovision Song Contest is tomorrow night, Saturday night. It's taking place in Italy. Ukraine are the favourites to win it. I'm conscious on the podcast that we have quite a large American audience. So, Francis, Venetia and Dom, can you tell us a little bit about Eurovision and specifically the contest this year, and why does it matter?
I mean, Eurovision is one of those things that I feel like you either love it or you just don't really get it. I will put my hands up and say that I'm in the second camp. I've never watched it, but of course I'm aware of it. It is a real cultural moment every year in Europe where the Europop's greatest get together and compete for the crown of Eurovision winner. And I mean, this year it's particularly significant because Europe has felt like it's been thrown into disarray the last few months. This is not a familiar place for Europe. In Europe, we learn about wars as something from history, and now it's here, it's on our doorstep, it's happening, and it's pulling all of us in, and we've been talking about it non-stop, as our listeners know. And I think this contest is a time where we can sort of think about the good things that bring European values together. And for the Ukrainian team in particular, it must be an amazing feeling to be sort of feel like not just Ukraine is behind them, but probably, almost all of Europe. They're by far the favourites to win. But big twist for our American listeners who may not get how big a deal this is. The UK is actually in second place to win, as in second favourite to win, to come second, sorry. If we do manage to pull that off, that would be extraordinary because we famously got nil point back a couple of years ago and are known for not doing very well in this contest despite our best efforts. So that will be one to watch tomorrow night.
Yes, I think we haven't won for 25 years. In 1997, I think it was Katrina and the Waves who won. Love Shines a Light. I'm admitting here my knowledge of Eurovision, but what can I say? My mother is a big fan. But just one other remark I would make on Eurovision. Yes, it seems very silly in the context of us talking about some of the other huge geopolitical issues we've been talking about today. But actually, it does have a role. It is a hugely popular contest watched by hundreds of millions of people, possibly even billions of people around the world with catch up. And it does, excuse the pun, shine a light on the geopolitical issues of the moment. So Ukraine, obviously, this time we expect to win, or at the very least to receive a lot of support from Europe, and that of course flags the issue to perhaps many countries around the world that have not really been following it as closely as we have in Europe. Also, it's political because of how often countries vote in political blocs. So it used to be the case where you and still is that you would see the former Soviet bloc countries that would sort of more vote for each other's countries. So you might get Romania voting for Bulgaria, or you might get I don't know. You get the gist, and you might get certain Western powers doing the same, but with time, actually, this is sort of perhaps starting to shift, and it'll be very interesting seeing on Saturday night whether we actually see a reflection of how Europe might be changing as a reaction to Russia. I should say that Russia have not been permitted to enter the contest this year, but no doubt there will be some reflection on the voting on those countries that are perhaps more in favour of what Putin has done. So yes, it's small in the grand scheme, but as far as how millions of people, hundreds of millions of people around the world are concerned, this will be a moment where their attention will be drawn to a European issue, no doubt, and that has an influence.
Thanks, Francis. And Dom Nicholls, on Saturday night, will you be watching Eurovision and supporting the UK or Ukraine?
I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I'm aware of Eurovision, a bit like I'm aware of the Canadian Ice Hockey League. It's sort of out there, and if I'm in a bar with some mates and it's on, I'll briefly take it. But I don't know. I mean, the person in the spandexy, the spangliest, shiniest trousers will do for me, and beyond that I'm going to adopt the Francis Dearnley defence of my mother is a big fan, ho ho.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Thank you, Francis, and thank you, Venetia. We're coming to the end of the week, so can we get your final thoughts on what we should be looking for over the weekend and into next week, please?
For me, it's I've said it for a few days actually, but I think that's because it is important, and these things don't just happen overnight. Northeast, southwest. So northeast, the Ukrainian pushback around Kharkiv, pushing Russian forces reportedly back as far as the border, and if they can do that, then they're soon into those supply lines coming down from Belgorod, which are keeping Russia in the fight in the Donbass. So this, although we're looking at the Donbass, it might be further to the north that has a real impact there in the next few days. And southwest Snake Island, for all the reasons that we spoke about at the start of this podcast, whoever owns Snake Island has got a massive operational advantage in the southwest there, and Russia simply has to hold that piece of rock if they want to do anything. They want to threaten an amphibious assault to the southwest, which is again a reason why Ukraine has to own it. So northeast, southwest for me.
Thanks, Tom. Finish, Rainey.
Yeah, I think the blockade of Ukraine, of which Snake Island is part of the story, I think is really important and just has such huge impacts and wider effects and repercussions for both Ukraine and the region and the world at large, with all the grain shortages that we're seeing. So I think that's one to watch. And keep an eye on what's happening in the Donbass, because the Russians don't seem to be making much progress there. And go read our bridge story. It's really brilliant. The title is A Bridge Too Far. You can't miss it.
A quick word to all of our international listeners, if you haven't heard of Eurovision. The Eurovision Song Contest is a continent-wide institution. It's watched by hundreds of millions of people every year. Every year, singers and bands representing their countries battle it out to be crowned European champion. Voting is done through a mix now of audience participation and a judges panel at the contest itself. Eurovision means glitz, kitsch, Europop, even Eurotrash, but also geopolitics, with countries often voting along linguistic, economic, or even diplomatic lines. On the one hand, then, it's just a silly competition, but on another, a mirror to the concerns and beliefs and sympathies of millions of Europeans. This year, the contest is being held in Turin, Italy. But how will it be reported in Ukraine, who are currently favourites to win? I spoke to Timur Miroshnychenko, a broadcaster and journalist who'll be commentating on Eurovision for Ukrainian television. He's a Eurovision veteran, having presented or commentated on every competition since 2007. Here's what he had to say. Well, Timur, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for talking to us. Could you give us a sense ahead of the competition on Saturday? How serious is Ukraine about Eurovision? Is it a big deal?
For Ukraine, Eurovision was a big deal even before the war started. And of course, right now, it's a huge arena where we can once again and again talk about our country and about the war in our country, which we, of course, want to stop as soon as possible. But this year, it's more symbolic, of course, because everyone in Ukraine wants to reach this victory. And it's going to be like, the first victory before the main victory we are all waiting for.
So across Ukraine, in Kyiv and across the different cities, how do people celebrate? Do they get together in parties? Will there be watching parties? How will Ukrainians be able to do it?
Officially, of course, it's impossible, because in different parts of Ukraine, different time of command and tower, I don't know how it's called in English, when it's abandoned to go outside. For example, in Kyiv, it starts at 10 p.m. till 5 a.m. in the morning, so you can't go anywhere. Of course, people gonna meet in their households, in their flats, in their places, but not officially in restaurants or squares as it was before.
Well, and your role on Saturday, what will you be doing exactly? Could you paint a picture of how Ukraine is going to cover this?
I'm going to comment all the events as usual, as 17 years, as for 17 years. Of course, inside me, a lot of different emotions, and it's hard to concentrate on musical event. But I realize that Eurovision was created 66 years ago just to unite all the nations after the Second World War. And maybe it's the most important contest in the history of Eurovision, just to once again to unite everyone, not only governments of their countries, but mainly people of that countries. It's very important, and I'll try to reflect all the atmosphere, all the vibes from Turin's Palaolimpico.
Russia was obviously banned from this contest a while ago. How did Ukraine react to that? How did you react to that?
As I remember, it was banned on 25th of February, just next day after the full-scale invasion. So our emotions were on the other side of the front, of course. And of course, we understand that it's a correct decision, because we can't, not only Ukrainians, everyone can't be behind the people who supports this bloody regime of Putin. Of course, it is very important. And as I know, they told just after the ban that they're going to quit European Broadcasting Union. And till 12th of May, European Broadcasting Union haven't received the official statement about it. They usually lying.
So let's talk about this contest. How's the war impacted how Ukraine's been preparing and how you've been preparing? I mean, I saw there's a video of you, I think it's gone around the internet now, broadcasting the semi-finals from a bomb shelter. To talk to us about that, how did that come about?
Of course, you can see that right now I'm not in a bomb shelter right now in the hotel. I will go to studio just after our interview. We have to be under the ground because you never know. You don't have a schedule of air raid alerts when Russia decides to launch their missiles here or there or there. We don't know where they will fly and so on. So we have to be under the ground just not to interrupt the broadcast. Just for this, and of course for security reasons as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Ukrainian entry? This is the Kalush Orchestra and their song, Stefania. I watched it earlier. It's a wonderful mix of rap and singing and vocals. What's the story of the song and who are the group? What should our listeners know?
It's a pretty young group. They appeared on Ukrainian stage several years ago. They are from the west part of Ukraine. Kalush is the name of the city in the Carpathian region. Very beautiful places, of course, there. And right now on stage, they are wearing traditional Ukrainian wear for Hutuls. It's a population of that part of Ukraine with the great traditions. And of course, they're trying to mix a lot of authentic Ukrainian instruments and mix it with modern style of music. And I think they do it not bad, very good. And of course, they are very popular right now because during last year, they gathered a lot of stadiums around Ukraine, across all over Ukraine. People love them, really. And this song Stefania is a dedication to soloist mothers, Oleg Psyuk. It's her name. And it was like this just till 24th of February. After 24th of February, it's a dedication to all Ukrainian mothers who are trying to get their children to safe places, to cover them from these terrible events. And even I can say that it's about Ukraine, because Ukraine is a mother for all of us.
Earlier on in the week, last week even, I interviewed a guy who's doing stand-up comedy, putting on comedy in the bomb shelters in Kyiv, and he said something really interesting. He said that the jokes that he was telling and the shows that he was putting on, it felt like it was his weapon, it was his resistance. And I was wondering, that kind of stayed with me, and I was wondering whether you feel the same way about the music and about the Ukrainian music that you're going to be commentating on. Is that fair?
Something like that, I think, because we're trying to defend our country in different ways, of course. If our armed forces fighting on the front line, of course, all of us trying to do something to help them. And of course, music, Ukrainian, especially Ukrainian music, it's a part of this battle as well. You know that before 24th of February, if you open, for example, iTunes chart in Ukraine, there you're going to find 8 or 9 songs from Russia and just one from Ukraine. Now we have cardinally another situation. Maybe you can find 1 or 2 songs from Russia, and they will be from that artist who didn't support Russian regime.
You've been commentating on all the semi-finals. You've got another one tonight, the final on Saturday. Can you give us any tips? Who should we be looking out for? Who's your favourite act? That's not Ukraine.
Yeah, of course, except Ukraine, because we can't vote for our own country. My favorites are the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain. This year we have 3 or 5 from Big Five who really pretend to win. Maybe we can add here Portugal, Poland, Lithuania, but less, of course, than UK, Italy, and Spain. So I think that UK, Italy, and Spain will fight for second place.
My next question is related to this. So obviously there's a big public vote. Who do you think the Ukrainian public are going to back if they can't back Ukraine? Who are they going to go for out of the Big Five, out of everybody else?
You know, now, of course, official data that about 6 million Ukrainians flee the war abroad. So a lot of them everywhere, in the United Kingdom, at Ireland, in the EU, everywhere. And of course, all of them dreaming about this victory. I think that people, for example, our Ukrainians in Poland, of course, they're going to vote for Polish artists just to send their love and for support from Poland, and so on and so on. If we are talking about Ukrainian votes in Europe, of course, Poland and the United Kingdom will receive, I think, the most from Ukrainian audience.
Okay, that's good to know. So that means we might not come last this year.
Definitely, you're going to be on the second place minimum.
I mean, you've touched on this, I think, in your first answer, but could you just give us a sense of what winning this, I'm jinxing it now, but what would winning this contest mean to you and to Ukraine?
Yeah, it's just a very symbolic moment. It will show again for all of us the power of support of all European countries. It is very important because, you know, of course, we're trying to fight by ourselves, but we can't do it. Russia is very big, and of course, we have to be united with all our neighbors. And you know, these 2.5 months showed us that our real brother, if we can say like this, our real brother is, for example, the United Kingdom, and one for Boris Johnson.
So what would your message be to, I mean, so this podcast has, I think the greatest number of people listening is from America, who might be listening to this entire conversation thinking, hang on, we don't know what's going on. But then the next highest, greatest number of people listening is from the UK. What would your message be to them?
Just a big kiss and hug from all Ukrainians, of course, because it's really very important for us. And we see her real friends, her real brothers, and it's not Russians, definitely. It's Polish people, British people, American people, but not Russia and Belarus.
Just a couple more questions from me. Could you talk a little bit about your experience in the war as a broadcaster? What have you been through? What's the last couple of months? What's happened in your life?
First weeks of the war, I didn't do nothing on TV because I'm an entertainment host, entertainment presenter, and of course, it wasn't at that time the best time for entertainment programs. I've been a driver, really. I drove thousands of kilometers across Ukraine, delivering some humanitarian aid, then grab some people and drive them to board, and so on, so on. After that, we started to do a lot of different charity events across Europe. And first in this series was in Warsaw, in Poland, and then it was the first charity marathon, Save Ukraine. It was broadcasted to all over the world, and as I know, 80 million people watched that show. Then I got back to Ukraine, to Kyiv, and we decided to relaunch our morning show. It's not about news, of course, it's about stories. So, of course, we focused on stories from the war, stories of the people, but in more light manner, and not so strict as on news, and so on and so on. So now I can say that I'm doing my regular job in Europe, in Ukraine, everywhere. But all money we spent right now on army and children and people who need this money. We don't need money anymore, really.
No, of course. It would be good just to hear a little bit more about your studio setup in the bomb shelter. I mean, could you sort of walk us through it? What are the different rooms? How many people are working on it? Is it cold? Is it warm? You know, what are the issues?
Yeah, it's pretty cold. It's pretty cold there. For example, today outside that was plus 27, something like that. But I have to catch my jacket or my sweater because it's going to be very cold there during a couple of hours under the ground. But about 10 people doing this broadcast. Of course, it's a digital team. It's a TV team who are receiving signal from Turin, who doing some stuff. I don't know what they do exactly. And me, I have a separate room, the most dangerous room. The most dangerous because the central OB, I think OB, some improvising OB1. Yeah, it's in the safest place, of course. And because my commentary bunker is just a temporary shelter and temporary place, and there in the underground, of course, they have a TV studio for news. Of course, they just create this space for 1 week, and the last place in the shelter, in the bunker, it was not the safest one.
Is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important for our listeners to know?
I don't know. I just once again want to thank all UK people for support. It's very important, of course. And doesn't matter who gonna win on Saturday. Really doesn't matter. We saw during the first semi-final so many Ukrainian flags in the audience, in the hands of the artists. We've heard their words, and this is a real victory for us. Of course, it'll be cool to win Eurovision, but the main victory that we can see once again that all civilized world, all civilized people are on our side.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Alice Hearing.